The town of Willow Creek woke to a sky heavy with gray clouds, as if even the heavens mourned what had been lost. Sheriff Henry Callahan, the man who had kept peace with a firm hand and steady voice, had been laid in the ground just yesterday. His young widow had stood at the graveside with her black veil drawn close, silent as the hymns carried over the prairie wind. People whispered that Margaret Callahan was too strong to faint and too proud to weep where others could see, but no one doubted the weight she carried now. Alone, widowed, left with a house too big for one woman and a town too small to forget her grief. The townsfolk gathered at the courthouse the following morning, some out of sympathy, others out of curiosity. They expected announcements about new elections or the naming of a temporary deputy. Instead, Judge Harmon cleared his throat and laid down a decree that shocked every ear in the room. To preserve order and the welfare of Mrs. Callahan, he declared, it has been decided she shall not be left to fend for herself. She requires protection, stability, and a roof kept steady by a man's hand. As such, she will be lawfully married at once. A gasp rose, half disbelief, half excitement at such scandal. The widow herself lifted her chin, though her pale fingers twisted together in her lap. Her lips parted as though she meant to object, but no words came. And the man chosen, Judge Harmon went on, ignoring the murmurs, as Cole Branson. The name rolled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Cole, leaning against the back wall in his dusty hat and trail-worn boots, straightened with a sharp jerk. His gray eyes flashed like flint. "You've lost your senses, Judge," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "I ain't marryin' nobody, and sure as hell not by order of the law." The judge slammed his hand against the bench, his face set hard. "You will, Branson, or you'll rot in my jail for every unpaid fine, every drunken fight, every reckless act you've carried out these past years. I've got enough writs to keep you behind bars till kingdom come." Cole's jaw tightened. He'd been in cells before, had fists bloodied in fights that never should have started, had drifted across counties with nothing but his horse and a bedroll. Jail didn't scare him, but as he turned, ready to spit a curse and walk out, his eyes met hers. Margaret Callahan sat still as stone, her veil hiding half her face, but her eyes, green as spring grass though rimmed in red from sleepless nights, met his with a calmness he didn't expect. She wasn't begging, she wasn't pleading, she was enduring, holding herself together with the last strands of dignity she possessed. And in that look, Cole saw something that made him pause, not weakness, but a quiet strength that shamed him more than any cell ever could. The wedding was arranged with speed that made it feel like punishment rather than celebration. The preacher spoke the words inside the church, the candles flickering in the drafty air. Cole muttered his vows like a man swearing an oath he'd never keep. Margaret's reply was so soft he almost didn't catch it, but it was enough for the preacher. No kiss followed, no smiles. Only the weight of stares from the town pressing down on them as though this union were a show staged for their amusement. Cole kept his hat low as he walked Margaret to the sheriff's cabin afterward. The house stood tidy on the edge of town, smoke curling from the chimney, the small patch of garden neat and orderly. It was the kind of place a man like Henry Callahan built with steady hands and steady dreams. Cole felt like an intruder the moment he stepped inside. The smell of lavender lingered from linens Margaret must have washed with care. Every chair, every shelf, every polished floorboard spoke of a life built with patience and purpose. Cole stood there awkwardly, a bear trapped in a parlor, while Margaret removed her gloves with quiet precision. "This ain't right," he muttered at last, unable to hold the silence. "You don't want me, and I sure don't want this. We both know it." Margaret lifted her veil, her face pale but composed. "Do you think I asked for it?" Her voice carried a strength that startled him. "Do you think this is what I dreamed of, Judge Harmon tying me to a stranger while my husband's grave is still fresh?" Cole opened his mouth, but no words came. He'd faced outlaws with pistols drawn, stood against storms that could sweep a man from his saddle, but he'd never faced the raw honesty in her eyes. She was no fragile flower. She was iron wrapped in silk. The next days stretched long and quiet. Cole refused the sheriff's bed, making himself a pallet by the fire instead. He rose early, left the cabin for hours, and returned only at dusk. Margaret moved about her chores with practiced grace, the scrape of a chair or the clink of dishes the only sound filling the rooms. They lived as strangers forced into proximity, each nursing their own resentment. But silence in the West was rarely permanent. One evening, the peace broke with the thunder of hooves and the drunken shouts of men who had long been held in check by Henry Callahan's badge. Rustlers rode into Willow Creek, swaggering through the saloon doors, smashing bottles, demanding whiskey without pay. Their laughter rang cruel and sharp, echoing down the main street. Folks hid behind shutters, whispering that the town was lost without its sheriff. Cole leaned on a post outside, watching, hand near his revolver but unwilling to draw. He wasn't law, not any more than a stray dog was a watchdog. But then Margaret stepped into the street. She wore no veil, her morning dress black against the gold of the setting sun. Her voice carried strong as she faced the men. "This is my town, my husband's town. You'll not dishonor his memory here." The rustlers jeered, one spitting near her boots. "Ain't no sheriff to stop us now, widow. Best get back in your house before you regret it." Cole's blood burned hot. He didn't think, didn't measure odds. His revolver was in his hand, gleaming in the dusk. The street fell silent as the barrel leveled steady. "I ain't Callahan," he said, voice like gravel. "But take one more step, and I'll put you in the ground just the same." The men hesitated, muttering, shifting in their saddles. And in that heartbeat, Margaret's eyes turned to Cole. There was no grief in them now, only something that stole his breath, faith. She believed he'd stand, believed he'd fight, believed he was enough. The rustlers cursed and pulled back, their bravado faltering beneath the weight of his stare. With a final spit, they rode off, promising they'd return with more men. The townsfolk peeked from behind shutters, whispering of Cole Branson, the drifter who'd faced down a gang for the sheriff's widow. That night, the cabin was warmer, though the fire burned no brighter. Cole sat by the hearth, his revolver resting on the table. Margaret moved quietly behind him, setting a cup of coffee by his hand. For the first time, their fingers brushed as she withdrew, the touch slight, unspoken, but enough to spark something fierce in his chest. He sat long after she'd gone to her room, staring into the flames, his hand still tingling from where hers had touched. Something had shifted, he didn't know what to call it yet. But it was there, alive, burning, changing everything. The days after the rustlers rode off passed with a quiet tension, the kind that made every creak of a floorboard sound sharper, every hoofbeat in the distance feel like an omen. The town buzzed with whispers of Cole Branson standing his ground, of Margaret Callahan's defiance in the street, and of how fate had bound them together in a way no one could have predicted. Some folks said it was providence, others muttered it was a mistake waiting to burn out. But inside the sheriff's cabin, life unfolded in small gestures that carried more weight than the loudest gossip. Cole still took his rest on the cot by the fire, though he no longer felt like an intruder in the house. He fixed the sagging fence one morning without being asked, his muscles working under the sun until sweat darkened his shirt. Margaret watched from the garden, her hands busy with the stubborn weeds, yet her eyes kept straying to the figure swinging the hammer. He worked like a man possessed, as though building something steady with his hands could mend the storms that had raged in his soul for years. She said nothing, but when he came in later, she had left an extra biscuit on the table beside his plate. Neither spoke of it, neither had to. Still, the shadow of trouble hung over Willow Creek. The rustlers hadn't been beaten, they had simply withdrawn, waiting to strike again with greater numbers. The townsfolk turned their wary eyes toward Cole, no longer seeing just a drifter but a man who had stepped into a role none of them could fill. They asked quietly if he'd defend them when the men returned. Some offered him whiskey, some tipped their hats, and some just stared, as if trying to decide whether he could truly stand in the sheriff's shoes. Cole gave them no promises, but he carried the weight of their stares like a burden he hadn't chosen yet couldn't set down. Margaret noticed the change in him first. He rose earlier, his jaw tighter, his silences longer. At night she would find him sitting on the porch with his revolver laid across his lap, the stars casting silver light across his worn features. She wanted to ask what he was thinking, but the words stuck in her throat. For weeks after Henry's death, people had tried to tell her what she needed, what she ought to do, what she ought to feel. Cole never did. That silence, she realized, was something like respect. The evening before the rustlers were expected to return, Margaret found him oiling his gun. The smell of iron and grease filled the air, and his hands moved with calm precision, though she could see the tightness in his shoulders. She lingered in the doorway before stepping onto the porch, her black skirts rustling softly in the breeze. He glanced up but did not stop his work. "You don't have to do this," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Yes, I do," he replied without looking at her. "Men like them, they don't stop unless someone stops them. Callahan held them back while he lived. Now it falls to me." Margaret's chest tightened at the mention of her husband's name. She stepped closer, her hand brushing the railing. "You're not him, Cole. You don't have to be." This time his eyes lifted, gray as storm clouds. "I know, but maybe I can be the man you need me to be." The words startled her, caught in the quiet space between them. She searched his face, expecting jest, but found only sincerity. Something inside her, wound tight with grief, loosened at that moment. Slowly, as though afraid he'd pull away, she reached out and touched his face. The rough stubble scraped her fingertips, and before she could draw back, he leaned into her touch. The kiss happened like a spark catching dry tinder, sudden, bright, unstoppable. His lips were rough, his hands uncertain as they settled on her waist, but it wasn't the kiss of a man forced into a vow. It was the kiss of someone who had been starving for belonging, finding it in the most unlikely place. Margaret melted into him, her grief and loneliness colliding with the fierce, unspoken promise in his embrace. When they parted, breathless, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Something new had been forged in that silence. At dawn, the rustlers came. Dust rose in the distance like a storm cloud, horses galloping hard, their riders shouting and brandishing rifles. The town stirred in panic, shutters slamming, mothers pulling children inside. Cole strapped on his gunbelt and stepped into the street, his boots crunching against the dirt. He stood alone, hat low, revolver heavy at his hip. From the boardwalk, Margaret watched, her heart hammering as though each beat might be her last. The rustlers reined in at the edge of town, their leader smirking down at Cole. "Where's your sheriff now?" he called, mocking. "Dead and buried, just like this town'll be when we're through." Cole's voice carried clear. "There ain't no sheriff, just me, and I'll bury you same as him if you lay a hand on Willow Creek." Laughter rose from the gang, sharp and cruel. Guns were drawn, and the air crackled with the promise of blood. Cole drew fast, faster than most eyes could follow. The first shot cracked the still morning, then another, and another. Horses reared, men cursed, bullets screamed through the street. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, her prayers silent but fierce as she watched the man who had once been a drifter fight like he had been born to stand between danger and the helpless. The fight stretched on, dust choking the air, gunfire ringing against the wooden fronts of shops and homes. Townsfolk peeked from behind barrels and fences, hope and fear warring in their eyes. One by one, rustlers fell or fled, until the last of them cursed Cole's name and spurred his horse hard out of town. Silence returned, broken only by the ringing in everyone's ears and the ragged breath of those still standing. Cole staggered, blood seeping from a gash on his arm where a bullet had grazed him. Margaret ran from the boardwalk, skirts tangling around her ankles, tears blinding her as she caught him before he fell. She held him against her, her hands pressed hard to his wound, her body trembling with the force of her relief. "Don't you ever leave me," she whispered fiercely, her lips brushing his temple. He managed a smile through the dust and pain. Guess the judge knew what he was doing after all. The town gathered around them, faces alight with gratitude, some clapping him on the back, others tipping their hats to the widow who had shown as much courage as the man at her side. But for Cole and Margaret, the world had narrowed to the circle of their embrace, to the heartbeat they felt pounding against each other's chest. That night, as the fire crackled low in the cabin, Cole lay bandaged but alive. Margaret sat beside him, her hand clasped in his, their fingers interwoven as though they'd been meant that way all along. No words were needed, no vows or decrees. They had been forced into a marriage neither wanted, yet had discovered something neither had dared to hope for. He was no longer a drifter, and she was no longer just a widow. They were something new, something forged in fire, kissed into being, and stronger than the fear that had once divided them. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and wild under the starlight, but within those walls, love had found them both, and it was fiercer than any outlaw that might ever ride into town again.